Chris said, I'm Katie Fox, and I'm here to talk about unit tests and why I like them and why I think you all might be able to get some use from them too. So here we go. First, this, I'm going to minimize that. Is that talking sidebar thing showing for you all, or just the PowerPoint?
Sorry, what's the talking sidebar you mean?
It's the Zoom control panel, which I guess is not showing for you.
I don't think so.
Wonderful. Okay. Hi. So slight modification to Chris's intro. I am now at eBuilder, a Trimble company out of South Florida. I'm working on their platform team, which is actually really exciting because I get to focus on a lot of these things that I'm going to talk about today. But I did work at Ultimate Software, which is half of what is now UKG for 8 years. Worked remotely for the last 5 out of the Seattle area, and I'm relocating to Atlanta later this month. I've attended PNSQC 4 times. This is my first time presenting. Kind of never thought I'd reach this point, and I'm here today. So we'll see how it goes. I am a cat mom, a runner, houseplant enthusiast. This is my cat Tink. One time she took over my laptop when I stepped away for a little bit, came back. She looked exactly like that, not staged, and it's my favorite photo to this date. And as far as plants, the plant on the right is what I bought when I got a new job because it, exciting things seemed like a good chance to buy a new plant to commemorate the occasion. So moving on now, if this will let me go. Oops. Okay, gonna learn how to navigate a PowerPoint again. So starting with why do I care about unit tests? Why am I here today? So this presentation origin came from interviewing senior tester candidates at UKG earlier this year. And my interview partner and I were really asking a lot of questions around the different types of test automation. So like your unit integration, functional tests, and trying to gauge like the candidate's understanding of what each one was, what benefits they provided, what risks might come along with them, and really like how do you use all these different types of automation together, really getting at there's not one perfect answer, but how do you work with them all? Especially given that, different people are writing the different tests. So your developers might be writing some, the testers might be writing others. And the overwhelming response that we got when asking about unit tests was that they were test developers right, which is true, but it was not the answer that we were looking for in terms of understanding what they provide, how they fit into your entire testing suite. And the more I heard this answer, the more I just thought about why do I feel differently about this? Why do I love unit tests? Why do I think they're really valuable? And then how can I share that knowledge with other people? So the more I thought about it and then saw the PNSQC call for proposals email, that this talk came out of it. But going back to, okay, where did I learn about them and why, what was the start of why I thought they were important? And as I thought about it, I realized it went all the way back to my initial interviews at Ultimate Software. And so first, it was kind of a 2-part to be hired as a tester. There was some testing techniques training and then a technical interview with one of the test leads. And the interview questions were a lot around object-oriented principles. But then over the course of the interview, really tying together the need for the good object-oriented design to write code that would then be testable. And it was all just kind of tying it together, but statements like we need to have this good object-oriented code so that we can write unit tests, and we need unit tests because we want to have a good test pyramid. And it was just all this, a little bit of assumed knowledge around it. So in my early career, things like test pyramid or shift left testing or agile, buzzwords that I heard, but didn't really understand what they meant and how you might be using them all together. So if we jump forward to now, my current focus and responsibilities, just the easy answer was lots of tests that look like code. And I realized after I created this slide that that's kind of correct, but it's really So I care a lot about the test automation and like your unit and integration tests and how do they fit well together and how does that influence maybe your functional UI tests, but also really realizing that like however I feel about it or whatever I think about it, like I can come up with all the best reasons in the world, but I am just one person on a team and these tests are written and maintained by ideally not just me. Like ideally I have other testers or developers helping with that. And so if we are not all on the same page with our strategy around this automation, then we're kind of like it's an uphill battle for me to try to change anything. And maybe there's input I'm missing from my developers around why something else would be better. Like they have a lot of technical insight and might come up with some really good strategies that I should learn. So I would say actually the current focus and responsibilities are a lot more like whole team, like collaborative communication on what our automation strategy is. And then also trying to shift left and get more of those, like write our code well so that we can have more valuable unit and integration tests. So if you hear me use the term or see it on the slides later, like collaborative shift left, that's kind of what I'm trying to describe here. So we'll see if I'm successful later. And so here, just if test pyramid or shift left are not familiar, I've got a couple quick diagrams to show. So on the screen, we see a pyramid, a triangle shape where the lowest, like if they're divided into horizontal 3 layers, then we have unit tests at the bottom that kind of make up ideally the bulk of our test automation, some integration tests in the middle, and then fewer functional UI tests at the top. And we're really trying to optimize this balance of like the trade-offs that we get between tests, which I denoted on the sides, where the unit tests run much faster than your functional UI tests, but in terms of confidence that they give you around the entire product and like how is it working and was there any regression, unit tests are lower on the confidence. So fast, lower confidence, while your functional tests are higher confidence and much slower, and your integration tests kind of bridge the middle. So the challenge that I take on is then how can we like optimize all these layers so we're getting, you know, as much done quickly without sacrificing that high confidence, because we also don't want to bridge any of these missing tests with manual testing as well. And then, sorry, I hope this font shows up large enough for you all. But so this is where I was getting at with like the collaborative shift left testing on the right. This was an attempt to capture how I think about what I knew about shift left testing when I started my job and what I care about now in this talk is touching on a little bit. So on the leftmost third, traditional testing, my perspective was, you know, the tester is doing much of that work, much of that attention to quality in the testing phase of the story work. And the analyst and the developer, each in their own analysis and coding cycles, doing a little bit, but not much, where shift left testing in the middle is, okay, maybe the analyst thinking more about edge cases for the requirements and the developer working on unit tests and also considering some more interesting code use cases during their work. And that means that the tester doesn't have quite as much work to do because we have some of that done already in the previous stages. But then really the thought here that if you don't, so for me as a tester, if I don't know, you know, what the developer already considered or wrote in unit tests, or, you know, if I don't learn those requirements as early as possible, it still takes a lot of work to test and to gather all that information. And so the idea here with the collaborative shift left is to have more collective conversations earlier and try to bridge some of those knowledge gaps earlier to then make like the final testing phase faster and easier. So we'll come back to this slide again later in the talk just to try to piece together some other things I'll touch on. But really the idea of think about the quality earlier, think about your edge cases and what you can cover in the different levels of automation, like as early as possible, and not wait until the testing phase to really sort all that out. Okay, so the next is just as a little bit of background. I put a lot more of this in the paper, but for the presentation today, I'm going to try to stick as much to the like takeaways and what I call useful information rather than just the background. But if you're curious about any of it, it's all in the paper. Feel free to read over that later or hit me up with more questions. So real team examples over 7 years that I'll touch on. These were with 4 different teams within the UKG Payment Solutions domain, which is, so UKG, our ultimate software, dealing with HR, but Payment Solutions was really dealing with taxes and the timely, accurate payment of different employee or employer level payroll taxes. And within these different team examples, trying to highlight as many of our collaborative shift left strategies and show how we used unit tests to bridge a lot of those conversations. And then also calling out the most common improvements that we found specifically where the tester through the code review process could help identify these areas to improve. So you don't need to have heavy code familiarity to do them, just the beginning to look at them and use them, and where you can start adding value within that big picture quality effort. And as a little bit of background on how we did work at the company, so just for how all these different conversations fit in, the different teams I worked on, they were each cross-functional teams, meaning there was an analyst, one or more analysts, developers, and one or more testers on each team. We used Kanban, Agile, which I'm not really going to dig into how that's different than Scrum, but the business value stories is probably the most important part. So because each unit of work had to have business value, they had to go through like a full mini software development lifecycle individually. So it wasn't like we had one task for the team that was, coding this, and another task later that was, okay, go test this area. But each story would go through analysis, development, and testing before it would be checked in. On these different teams, we had a variety of different technologies, and that resulted in some different testing strategies, different headaches, different ways of making that easier. Again, outlined a lot more in the paper, but I'll touch over some of that. And then I think I mentioned it before, but just for the purposes of this talk, when I'm using SDLC or software development lifecycle, I'm referring to the part just owned by our development team. So the analysis, the coding, and the testing efforts, not as much the UAT and going live in production. So team 1, I categorized as this was the experience of creating our test pyramid. And so this was a brand new team working on a brand new project. So the code and tests are all coming from scratch. We had some pretty experienced engineers, and our testers were all pretty brand new. I was one of them. This was my, I think, like second year at the job, maybe. And I had not written or read a unit test up to this point. And so this was a new experience, and there was no existing code to test at the time. And so the tester's first area of contribution was to actually review or write some of the unit and integration tests, while the developers would write the code, and then we'd pretty much copy and paste and tweak the existing unit and integration test coverage. And that's how we got familiar with it. And we started with maybe 6 or 7 engineers on the team, and eventually that doubled to 15, I think, by the end. But the patterns that we established within our unit and integration test practices then made onboarding those new team members a lot easier, because we were able to develop some consistency and create some, useful functional tests that would really describe how the product worked. And so the experience on this team was like, oh, tests are pretty useful, for documentation and knowledge transfer. And because we cared about the testers cared about consistency, we really tried to like establish some patterns and, clearly communicate those with our team or document them to whatever level that was helpful. And then we could make some judgment calls on, okay, we're going to automate this at the integration test level because we know what unit tests we have. So yeah, cohesive test pyramid and stayed in sync for the most part on those. So moving on then, team 2 called this inheriting legacy code. And so, clicked forward to. So inheriting legacy code, which was painful, and there were no unit tests, and there was no time to write them. And then when we did, if they weren't done well, we would get bugs. So the takeaway here was large pattern large team, no pattern, different styles, and struggled to stay in sync. Oops. Team 3. So with this team, I joined another one that was starting from scratch and had experienced engineers, and was able to really put into practice both what I learned from team 1 and team 2 to let's design our tests better and use them as clues to refactor proactively if they started getting complicated. And then finally, team 4, I nicknamed rediscovering quality because I joined this team after they hadn't had a tester for a year. And so there were just some practices that weren't quite ironed out. And so again, trying to figure out what strategies I'd used on previous teams and how to put them into practice with this team, and improve our quality now that we had a dedicated person, and think about it big picture. I'm going to skip through team summary because I kind of went through those both really quickly. So these collaborative shift left strategies, and again, just a lot more conversations and checkpoints each time. So story kickoffs were at the beginning of pulling a task in for development, where the analyst and developer and tester would just discuss the requirements, the strategy around, coding or testing that, any related work that we should consider, and really helpful for giving the tester a heads up around what they would be testing later on. The second strategy was to include testers in the code review process. Again, they might not be super familiar with the code or looking at it from is this correct implementation, but we still found that there were ways that the tester could pay attention to some details that the developer might not. And so most of those strategies will be in the second half of this presentation. Dev and test, or developer and tester discussing automation strategies. Again, we'll cover that a little bit later, but just the idea that more conversations between these two roles was really helpful, because if you think about that test pyramid where you're trying to kind of line everything up to fit well together, but if you're having this automation written by multiple persons in multiple roles, you need to have a very strong cohesive strategy around that. And so you could create a very outlined process around this, or you can have more frequent discussions with it, which is what I found was helpful. And then finally were the story desk checks, where this was an after development, before testing kind of checkpoint to make sure at minimum that all the requirements within the story had been met during coding, that we're not going to test a story that doesn't even satisfy the requirements, much less the edge cases. So one more time to this diagram around the collaborative shift left testing. So hopefully this right side makes a little bit more sense with some of those strategies where analysis, so this collaboration kind of represents those story kickoffs that I was talking about. And then in this coding collaboration, the desk check, like making sure the requirements were met and brainstorming any test cases. And then the testing at the end here and any final questions that would need to go back to the analyst. Probably could have put in developer for any sort of rework that needed to be done as well. Forgot that. Yeah, so just trying to move as much of the testing and edge case consideration left as possible. All right, so now we're getting into some of the hopefully more practical application. So going back to what testers could contribute during the code review process, we've got a few, I think it's 4 different areas of improvements that testers were able to look for on these teams. And so first one was descriptive names. In particular, this was valuable because when you write your test initially, you understand what they're doing, but you look at them a year or 2 later and maybe they don't make as much sense. And the name can be a really useful area to add some detail around what the test covers. Alternative methods would be like to add lots of commenting or a summary on top of it, but test names were one of the first strategies that we put into place for just let's capture what the test is doing. So for these examples here, update record, I just thought of 4, like this representing some experience I've had where you have an error case and a failure case. And so the question, like, what's the difference in those? And then here was an attempt at revising those names to show, okay, instead of update record error, let's add a little bit more about what that scenario encompasses. So update record, when the record is not found, returns an error. Or for example, at the bottom, update record, when the record is found and the update fails, returns warning. So whether or not that's actual good code implementation doesn't matter, but it does, the name does tell you what the test does. And actually it might raise the question of, if your update failed, is returns warning actually what you want to be doing? Or maybe we should consider a different approach there. Like as a tester reading that, that's what I would think is, why is the update failing meriting a warning where just when the record isn't found, returns an error? So even if I'm not reading through the tests in detail, if the test name is representing what it does, that gives me an opportunity to question, hey, is that behavior actually what we want here? And so for myself and for other testers on my team, we found this pretty helpful, just verifying that that we could get an idea of what the test was doing by reading the names. And then if we couldn't, prompting the developer to go back and add a little more detail there. Oh, this one, I struggled with creating a good example, but the point was to make sure that the setup within the test was clean. So this would go a step beyond just reading the names. And it would be reading a little bit more within the test itself. So if as a tester, you're comfortable with that, then going through and making sure anything within the setup for the test makes sense and you understand how it's used, with the purpose of, or the end goal of, like, anything that's useless is just kind of adding clutter and technical debt over time, because it's going to make that test more difficult to understand a year or 2 down the line. So this frequently came about from copying and pasting without then cleaning up anything that was unnecessary. So for example, like assigning values to the object properties where that value didn't actually influence anything within the test path. So going back to that update record example from the previous slide, like let's say I filled in a notes field on the record and that had nothing to do with the update method itself, but I have that in the setup for my test. I look at that a year or 2 later and might ask, hey, why, like, does this notes field matter? Maybe that's something to do with why this test is now failing. But if it doesn't, or it shouldn't, then assigning that value within the test just creates confusion. And then the second item here is set fake dependencies that aren't relevant. That can add additional clutter. So if I'm, setting up the logger to fail on some call, or, a different repo return an empty list, but that setup doesn't even matter within the span of the test. Again, just adding clutter and confusion. So with the takeaway here, that each line in the test, and the emphasis on the setup here, should be meaningful and easily understood. So for me as a tester, even though I didn't write these tests, with some ability to read the code, I should be able to take a look and somewhat piece together what the test is doing, or understand why different values matter. Improvement 3 was just no branching logic, which I might be preaching to the choir here, or I might not, but this was still kind of a constant area of vigilance, especially as we would, onboard new developers, it just found that frequently it was an area where it seemed like you might be saving time and optimizing the tests by not having two different tests that were 90% the same. But time and time again, we found that just added confusion later on when we'd need to go back and refactor, or some tests would start failing after the method was changed. And so keeping each test as small and concise as possible. So the example here was just, if I had a test errors method where this is fatal parameter coming from the test case. So for true or false, in both cases, we're going to be calling the test method and we're going to be checking that it returned an error, but just depending on whether, one setup, I think there was something else I was supposed to add in here, but let's say you pass in a true or false to this test method and then the result is different. There's no branching logic. So branching logic can look like if else conditions, or it can look like ternary logic in there. Usually on our teams, it was used to either update the setup in one or two different ways, or to add an additional one or two assertions, or to create a string that would be asserted against at the end, and maybe append a few extra conditions. But again, long term, short term, it might result in less lines of test. Long term, it's getting pretty cluttered. Oops. All right. Useful failures. All right. So this is with using fluent assertions. And going to skip to the end here. So the point is that looking at how an assertion would fail and what type of error message it would give you adds a lot of value to your unit tests as they age and get older. And so this was one that I found, because typically as the tester, I'm the one merging. And so being able to understand why a test failed and if that seems related to the code changes from the story I'm merging was really important. So I highly recommend fluent assertions. And what I find them very useful for is, say in this top section, where for each one, I'm checking that the value is 1 for each of these items. If the first one fails, I don't get to find out if the other two succeeded or also failed. But the difference being in this last contain only, it tells me if all the items match this condition or which one did not. And so I have a huge appreciation for, if assertions fail in the middle, I want to know, well, how many of them really passed and how many of them really failed. So highly recommend fluent assertions, but at minimum, check and see how your failure message will look. If it does fail, because when you maintain that later, it's a pain. All right, I am getting low on time, so I will just breeze through these and say that for UI testing, found a lot of value in unit tests because they could capture web page state testing in a way that if there are many combinations, so say I've selected records and they all need to have status valid to enable this button, I don't have to go clicking around on the UI a ton to see, okay, if all of them or all -1 are selected, how does this button work? Have unit tests that drive that. and then see just like an equivalence class of positive and negative case in my own testing. Similar thing for business rules. Let's say I had a record update to like if this was a requirement. So allow record update to in transit only when valid status, positive amount, and regular type. Well, as a tester, I look at that and think, okay, well, I need to check that all of these together allows the record update, and that if any one of them is different, that the update doesn't occur. So I would go and look for unit tests that kind of cover all of those within one method. So checking an in-transit, can't click on this, an in-transit status with value, 100 and regular. So in this case, the status is already in transit, not valid. It shouldn't work. And the same with checking the amounts. I can check those boundary cases and really just see, is there a unit test that captures all of this that I can then just add additional cases for, rather than having to set up all this data in the database and then keep modifying it and making sure it's being returned correctly. All right. One more example would be with batching. Again, these are just looking within the test to find batching or to find item potency. I described a lot more in my paper, but I'm running very short on time now. And so the conclusion that I had here was that unit tests are valuable. And once you know the types of code or rules that they will exercise, then you can take elements of your testing process and find ways to, or know what to look for in the unit test, so that you don't, I keep saying you, but I mean, I don't have to go do that manually. So around the state transition rules or the web page elements, if I can break all of these down into smaller verifications and go find some of those at the unit test level, then from my manual testing effort, I'm just trying to hook those all up together, but not test every single combination of every single rule. And so I think from my experiences with teams, establishing an early foundation is imperative if possible, because it's a real headache to add later. Collaborating with the developers will create more valuable test scenarios. You really want to look for useful error messaging on your unit tests, because if they fail years down the line, you don't want to spend an hour or more trying to debug that. And then it's a constant improvement process. Like in my paper, I go over a lot more, learn, improve, try again with different teams. And so it's never just all perfect and done, but do it together as a team, because even just one person trying to create all the right answers, you've got a whole group of people working on these. And so you need to be on the same page with it to succeed there. And thanks for listening. Here's my info for LinkedIn or email, and another beautiful picture of my cat Tink, because, why not? Okay, I guess I will kill sharing here and open it up for questions. Chris?
Thank you so much, Katie. That's fantastic. We've got, you can ask questions in chat, or feel free to just speak up if you want to. Where can we find your paper, says Sean?
Yeah, so that looks like the answer is in there. Wait, no, never mind. The paper should be accessible online from the different presenter areas. Is that correct, Chris? I'm describing this as...
Yeah, I'm not sure myself. The papers are available online for sure, but I can't direct you exactly to where.
I believe there was an email sent out about that, but basically wherever you would find my bio and abstract for this talk, there should also be links to presentation and paper. There we go, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Other questions in chat or out loud?
Since we're talking pretty full stack with unit testing, how did you get where you were comfortable giving directions on both front end and back end as far as how to test?
Oh gosh, I think not getting into it from the beginning of my career and not really having like a more senior necessarily tester on the team, it was a lot of just learn and trial and error. So one of the things I recognize now is that like patterns I established and said, hey, we should do it this way, 6 or 7 years ago, I would never say now. But I got really lucky with the developers that I had on my team, and they were very like a mixture of some that didn't care as much, but some that were like very conscientious and would put some good patterns in there. And so then I just learn them and continue to share those on with every other team that I work on. So I would say like a good early foundation with some developer mentors. Let's see, buy-in from the team on unit and integration testing. So Riley, I think that's where my team, in the way that they always worked, having like that cross-functional team. So it never felt like I had to kind of fight uphill to get that, which I recognize isn't a super helpful answer. But I feel like we always had developers that were really appreciative of anything that the tester could learn or do to help them out. So I feel like it was really developers recognizing their own limitations with how much they wanted to think about the coding and think about the tests and the quality. And so anything that they could do to help get us up to speed and have more conversations around that, like the developers like talking about the code. So as long as testers wanted to, it was an easy conversation to have. But from if you're getting pushback like from the manager level or that not falling within your role, that's not really something I'd overcome, because it was an expectation when I started at the company that this was something that testers would be familiar with. And so as far as the documenting Mia on unit tests, I think that for each team was kind of a judgment call of where does this need to be captured, or like I would say for me, creating the test plan or the test cases first of like, hey, I want to, make sure this combination of everything for this button is tested. You're creating the test plan first and then going to see if there are tests that already match those cases, rather than looking at the tests first and then, creating your test plan. Like you don't want to be, if you're looking at clear box testing, you don't want that to be kind of shaping how you're testing the story. You're wanting to use all those as like check marks for, hey, what you would already test, and then fit those into your test plan. And so I could imagine, capturing the names or something there.
Katie, we are a little over time, so if you don't mind, I will ask people to forward any additional questions onto your email address or catch you in the spatial chat or whatever works best for you. Perfect. And thanks again.
Yeah, that sounds so great. Thanks, Chris. Have a good day, everyone.